Hi class, this is Professor Bay. We're going to talk about Chapter 9 today, Revolution. After World War II, Latin American industrialization lost momentum and the economic independence proved to be very difficult because they were trying to compete against the US, who was starting to build an economy again after World War II. There was a growth in population due to the improvements of sanitation and health that lowered the death rate, so less people were dying, so the population kept growing. In 1900s, there were 61 million Latin Americans, and in 1950, 158 million, and by 1960, 200 million. So you can see the big growth in population from 61 million to 200 million in 60 years. Urban population rocketed. Many of the big cities all surpassed a million inhabitants after World War II, and many other followed by 1960. Shantytown dwellers grew as well, so a lot of poverty in the outskirts of the city. Many of the Latin Americans began to believe that the revolutionary change was needed. Nationalism was considered anti-US and Marxist, communist. Post-World War II, there's populism. Populism was a leadership style that focused on mass politics and winning elections. Voting was open to women, and voting age was lowered to 18. So they want massive votes, supported by popular vote and a lot of people. In Brazil, the majority voted to make Getúlio Vargas president again in 1951. Nationalism now adopted populist political tactics, flying candidates around the country, and they will hold like huge rallies, and they will make use of the radio to reach the masses. They wanted to attract working class voters with a vision of improvement of living conditions without scaring away the middle class voters with the images of class warfare. Latin American industrialization began to slow after World War II. The U.S. consumer goods were available again, so it was really hard to compete with U.S. because U.S. always had better equipment and better industrialization. To compete, Latin American manufacturers needed new machinery, and even though they had the buying power, they had the capital to buy it, Europe was rebuilding and has shortage of capital goods on the war market. And the ones who are getting the best equipment are always Europe and the US. The Economic Commissions for Latin America, ECLAO, was set up by the United Nations, and the leader, Raúl Prebisch, focused on Latin America's peripheral position, exporting raw materials within a global economy that was dominated by industrialized centers, the US and Europe. So the industrialized centers are US and Europe producing the big stuff, and they said that Latin America should focus on doing the side raw material production and exporting that, to just fit the economy. The response to social needs and the hostility of the U.S. Responds with populism. In Argentina, Juan Perón is an example of that populism. He was a nationalist officer who was a Secretary of Labor, won a strong following among Argentine workers, and fearing his influence, he had removed from office in October 17, 1945. So he was becoming too popular, and they were scared of that, so they removed him from the office of Secretary of Labor. And there was a lot of demonstrations of workers that gathered in downtown Buenos Aires. And then after that, October 17 becomes Peronist Royalty Day. Perón becomes president 1946 to 1955, and unionization of the country's industrial workforce. Eva Duarte de Perón, or Evita as she's known, she becomes the wife of Juan Perón, and she was adored by the people. She was a glamorous actress of radio soap operas who came from very humble backgrounds, and she created a social aid foundation where she liked to hand out charity personally. She'll be there handing out to people. She'll be listening to people in person. So imagine being a first lady doing things in person. She was loved by many people in Argentina, especially by the poor and the women who were inspired by her. Evita helped win the vote for Argentine women in 1947 and advocated for equal pay for equal work. So she's considered a feminist who did a lot of things for women's rights, but it's very interesting. She always stated, even in her memoir that she wrote, that her love for Perón is the one that is steering all this um, activity. And, it's more like she has a patriarchal tradition in her mind. She believed that woman's highest aspiration should be marriage and motherhood, to be a mother. And she presented herself as the mediator, like a bridge between Perón and the people. And she died suddenly in 1952 from cancer at a very young age. And people were devastated when she passed away. She's almost like immortalized, and she was very much loved, more than Perón, Juan Perón. The Peronist government tried to end foreign ownership, make public utilities. He brought, expropriated the country's important meatpacking plants, banks, and insurance companies, and the extensive British-owned railway system. He expanded social services. So they're trying to take all those industries away from the foreigners. A severe economic downturn and a popular quarrel with the Vatican undermined the middle class support, and the military exiled Perón in 1955, but his supporters remained loyal. This is the Eva Perón Museum. If you can visit it, you can go see it. It's right in the city. It looks like a little house, and you go in there and it tells the whole story, how she participated in helping people in person. And it's the whole history of her inside this museum. You can also visit her tomb in Recoleta Cemetery, which is right in Buenos Aires, and it's one of the most beautiful cemeteries that you visit. And her tomb over here is one of the most popular tombs to visit in Argentina, and in this cemetery. And you can see flowers that people still bring today when they come see her tomb. She's very much loved by the Argentinian people, especially the women. Brazil, when the military ushered Vargas out of office in 1945, he had prepared a populist comeback by founding two political parties. And he returned as president in 1950 as a candidate of the Brazilian Workers' Party. But he accomplished very little this time as compared to in the past. And they said that he ended up committing suicide in 1954. The new capital is moved to Brasilia. And Brasilia is this ultra-modern design that you will see of a city. They have widely spaced apartment blocks, was constructed with vast outlays of government resources at the expense of a surging inflation. So they were in big trouble economically, but they built this town in the interior of the country. And it looks so modern, it looks beautiful, it makes you want to go see the town. And it's very futuristic urban planning of the style of Le Corbusier, who is a Swiss French architect, and they believe he's a pioneer of modern architecture. Original public buildings, partly subterranean, cathedral that you will see, made their creator Oscar Niemeyer, best known Latin American architect. It looks ultra modern, the whole city, and they said they tried to create a utopia, right, like an ideal city for the future, and it looks very futuristic. Brasilia was inaugurated in 1960, so it's a very new town, and the symbol of the post-Vargas moment in Brazil. So here you can see the cathedral that is underground, designed by Oscar Niemeyer. And look how it looks inside. Isn't that amazing? With the lighting and all that. It's beautiful, beautiful. I want to go see it one day. And you see the National Museum of the Republic with the reflection of the water. It looks beautiful. Very modern, very futuristic design. This is the National Congress of Brazil. So you can see all this, and I have a little video that I'll post for you so you can watch about this amazing city that they built and inaugurated in 1960. In Mexico, the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party, with a one-party system with the military, under the control of the PRI. So it's the Partido Revolucionario Institucional, and they say it had a very questionable democracy because each president would handpick the next candidate to become the PRI candidate, and he always won the election. So whoever they handpick always became the next president. So it's rigged elections. Mexican industrial growth continued. PRI held the political royalty of many who had benefited from the land reform. So they're the followers. Because of the government marketed food grown on the restored common lands called ejidos, it could hold food prices down, and in effect, this helped the urban living standards. It really subsidized the urban living standards in Mexico. The Mexican Revolution had been largely a rural uprising. Its ultimate winners were urban people. So even though it was a rural uprising, the urban people end up benefiting, right, from all this food subsidy, for example. The economic pie grew overall, but the redistribution of wealth stopped. So remember, after the revolution, they had distributed lands to people and all that, but the whole thing stopped, and there wasn't great improvement in their welfare during the PRI's half-century rule. Onset of the Cold War. In the 1950s, the U.S. was the model of progress. Okay? Post-war prosperity, good living standards, and the superpower was no longer the good neighbor. So remember the good neighbor policy, where the U.S. could not invade Latin America with military force? That policy was gone. In 1947, the U.S. martial law spent vast sums rebuilding Europe post-war and limit the appeal of communism. So the major recipients of the Marshall Plan aid were the U.S. enemies of World War II, because they don't want them to become communist again. So they're putting their influence there. Latin America only got about 2% of U.S. foreign aid between 1946 to 1959. In 1947, the U.S. convened hemispheric nations to sign the Rio Pact, a permanent Pan-American defensive alliance. It was an agreement binding the republics of the Western Hemisphere together in a mutual defense system. The treaty provided for mutual assistance in case of an act of aggression, that threatened the Western Hemisphere. So they're supposed to bind together and protect each other. In 1949, China's Communist Revolution triumphed, and Soviet Russia tested an atomic bomb, and the Cold War began in its earnest, they say. A few more heavier industries that began to appear in Latin America were often subsidiaries of the U.S. multinational corporations. They got used machine retired from the U.S. plants, planned not to compete with the U.S. So they're getting the second-hand stuff while the U.S. is getting the first-hand stuff, right? Any opposition in Latin America was seen as a sign of communism, and the U.S. anti-communist diplomacy was the Organization of American States, OAS, a bigger version of Pan-American Union and dominated by the U.S. In 1954, OAS issued the Declaration of Caracas, saying that all Marxist revolutionary ideology and revolutionary movements will be treated as foreign invasions.